So yes, as he said, I'm from Jackson, Mississippi, and that means that I'm especially qualified to talk about what it's like living in a very religious environment as somebody who's not. Although again, the more that I get out, I keep saying this a lot, but the more I get out, the more I find out that what I thought was unique to Mississippi is not. That what I thought was just in the Deep South is actually present. Can y'all hear okay in the back? What I thought was unique to Mississippi is present all over the country as long as you get about 20 minutes away from any major city. You know? 20 minutes out of every city in the country, you're back in the Bible Belt again. And you're dealing with the same culture that I'm dealing with. The difference is, where I live, it's that way even in the cities. And the people who run everything are very, very religious. So that's my environment. I want to talk today about building bridges between the religious and the non-religious. Building bridges between faith and doubt, I think is what we titled it. I don't know if you got that on there or not, but this is something that's very important to me personally because I'll give you a little bit of my story for those of you that aren't familiar. I grew up Southern Baptist in Mississippi, and while we were mostly nominal believers when I was young, as I became a teenager, I got very, very sold out for Jesus. You know, I got very into my faith, and it became an all-consuming thing for me. Eventually, I went to seminary and got a Bible degree and began a non-traditional ministry in a house church movement for about 10 years. And so my faith was my whole life. But in my mid-30s, I got to the point where I realized I didn't really believe the same things anymore. It took time to get to that point, but when I did, that was a disruptive thing for me, as you can imagine. Because by the time you're in your mid-30s, you've built your whole life around a certain mentality. So my transition out of the faith really disrupted a lot of things, most of my major relationships. I don't want to get into all the details, and you can go online and see some of that stuff, but mainly what I want to talk about is what that has taught me about what to do and what not to do in order to maintain relationships with people who are still inside the faith. I feel like I learned as many things not to do as I did to do. You know, I feel like I made more mistakes than anybody else, which makes me in a better place than many to talk about what to do and what not to do. That's going to be a little bit hot over there. One of the things I've noticed is that the way that we approach talking about faith and talking about religion with those who are religious is we have gotten really bad at it as a culture. And it's not our fault. It's not unique to religion. It's a problem for our whole culture. The more conversation, public conversation, has moved onto the internet, the worse it's gotten. You know, if you try to talk to someone face to face, you are going to have a person-to-person conversation where you pick up on, you know, small cues, nonverbal communication. You can tell when something pains them because they grimace. And you can tell when they're joking. And you get all that nonverbal communication. But when you're communicating online or in some sort of a public forum like that, especially that's text only, you miss out on a lot of stuff and you end up miscommunicating. And there's something, too, about the way that our culture has gone it's become very polarized. Personally, I blame Fox News. And not just Fox News, but really the entire media industry has become very, very polarizing. And that affects the way we talk about things like politics and religion. And people who used to be able to have civil conversations can't anymore. So all that to say, our public dialogue stinks when it comes to religion. We are just very, very, very polarized. And it may be that there's something about religion in particular that it's very hard to have good conversations about with people who think differently. You know, it's kind of proverbial at this point that around the dinner table at Thanksgiving, you don't bring up politics. You know? Well, it's that way with religion as well. And I understand it's a very emotional topic for many people, but if you live in my life, it's a non-negotiable that you have to learn how to communicate with people who are from an opposite side of this divide. You may not be in that situation. Some of you might be in a situation where you're surrounded by people who think mostly like you. Or if you're not, then maybe you're at a place in your life where people know who you are, they know what you think and what you don't think, and they're not going to push it because they've learned a long time ago not to push it with you. I live in Mississippi, however, and I'm one of the few atheists in my area. And the more that I've come out about that, the more I've had to deal with fielding the kinds of questions that somebody gets in a very religious environment. So I want to talk about how to approach these differences and how not to approach them, because our public dialogue is not very productive lately. Also, you'll notice that the people who get the most attention, who are pushing for secularist movement are not always doing a good job of representing our interests because they are just as polarizing. It's not just the religious people who are being dogmatic. Sometimes atheists can be too. So I want to talk about that. There's value in learning how to do this because even if you yourself are not in a situation like mine where everybody close to you is very religious, it still is better for the free thought movement in general to get better at talking about what it is that we believe and don't believe, because otherwise we're not really winning anybody else's minds over. We're just preaching to the choir, as we said. Okay, so I want to talk about what it's like to talk to Christians about what it is that we believe and don't believe. And part of the problem with defining that is that Christian can mean a lot of things, right? There's a lot of different kinds of Christian. Some are fundamentalist, right? Some have a very, very rigid mentality about old earth, young earth, creationism, about what you should wear, what kind of movies you should watch, what kind of schools you should go to. That's a culture unto itself. But not everybody's a fundamentalist. There's a lot of things in between. There are also evangelicals, which many times believe the same things as fundamentalists. Many times there's not a difference, except it's a stylistic difference. People who call themselves evangelicals, they often believe the same thing as fundamentalists, but they just have a little bit more sophisticated vocabulary. They might even make the same points in a conversation, but instead of quoting a Bible verse to make their point, they quote a university study. And they're saying the same things. It's just a stylistic difference. It's a slight cultural difference. Christian could also mean progressive Christian. More and more these days, there is a middle place being made where people identify as Christian and they speak very highly of Jesus, but they don't really seem to stick to the same talking points that fundamentalists and evangelicals do. Many progressive Christians aren't interested in fighting gay marriage. They aren't interested in controlling, the birth control debate in public forums. There's a lot of cultural differences between progressive Christians and evangelicals. So when I talk about building bridges between people who believe and people who don't, and building better relationships and better conversation, you have to first ask, where is this person on the other side of this aisle? Where is this person in the spectrum of belief? Because they're not all in the same place. And my advice to you as to how to improve your communication with people who don't think the same way as you is, first of all, find out where they are on the spectrum. Don't assume right away that you know everything that they believe. Even finding out what denomination someone is doesn't tell you everything they believe, does it? I don't know if you've noticed, but the people who say, I'm a Baptist, does not mean that you know everything they believe. My parents were Baptists, and Baptists didn't believe in drinking. But we had a wet bar at our house. Okay, yeah, I know, right? So there's enough of a variety of what people believe and what they practice, and of course there's jokes too about Baptists and drinking. One is that if you have drinks at your house, if you invite one Baptist to your house, they won't touch a drop. No, they drink up everything you've got if you invite one. But if you invite two Baptists, they won't touch a drop. And I didn't used to understand that. I do now. They'll catch each other in the liquor store and they won't look at each other when they go in, But I grew up in a less fundamentalist area, and culture. So I didn't realize what most people's perception of Baptists were. There's a lot of variety, is my point. So don't assume that you know everything about what a person believes. And that even means someone as close to you as your own family. In my situation, I am the only atheist in my family. My wife and I divorced after I left the faith for a number of reasons, but honestly the central one to me is that when we tried to work through our differences, we were not able to figure out a common ground for us to work through our differences. We tried to reach for tools to help us work through our differences, and there just weren't any because they either were, all the ones in our area were Christian. All of the therapists were Christians. And we went to a Baptist minister for our marriage therapy. Well, for an atheist, that really wasn't the ideal thing to do. I should have been thinking a little bit better through that. I'm not sure what I was thinking. But it's really hard to find common ground in an area where everything is so polarized. And that's why it's become such a big thing for me to try to figure out how do we learn how to communicate and find those common ground. A couple of things that I've done to give you an illustration of why this matters to me and how much this matters to me is, number one, the interview that Galen mentioned. My first coming out as an atheist was agreeing to an interview with a pastor in the Jackson area. Back a couple of years ago, a friend of mine was putting together a national interview an atheist at church day, where they were trying to get pastors to invite non-believers to come in for an open interview in front of the congregation. Now, outside of Mississippi, that was hard to find as it was. But inside Mississippi, it was almost impossible. I didn't think anybody was going to agree to that. But we found one not too conservative pastor who was willing to do that. And we met for lunch a couple of times, and we decided on what we wanted to talk about ahead of time. And the interview went great. It was a smashing success as far as I was concerned. It was very respectful. You know, he asked some questions, I answered them. The congregation asked some questions, and I answered them. And he tried to weed out all of the debate questions, because that's not the direction he wanted to go with that at the time. We were looking for common ground, and we were trying to teach how to have conversation. And it went very, very well. And most of the positive responses I've got from readers is when they've told me, I loved that. I wanted to see an example of an atheist and a Christian sitting down and having a civil conversation. So that's when I realized this was something that was a great need. Just this past weekend, I was in the Chicago area, and do any of y'all know what VeggieTales is? Have you ever heard of VeggieTales? You got any kids or grandkids that? Okay, my kids grew up on VeggieTales because we discovered it's a kids cartoon for Christians, and I thought it was really cute growing up, and my kids loved VeggieTales. We memorized all the songs, we memorized all the episodes, just short little 30-minute cartoons starring cartoon vegetables. And so Phil Vischer, who created VeggieTales, lives in Chicago, and he's got a podcast, and it's a Christian podcast. But he and I had some dialogue over the years by email about some of the things he's written on his blog. So he invited me to come up and sit in on his podcast, which means that now, next week, he's going to put his podcast up, and all of his Christian listeners will listen to us have a conversation about our differences and similarities. And this is the kind of thing I want to see a lot more of, because it helps exemplify what this looks like. And I'd love to see more people jumping in and doing the same thing with different kinds of Christians. And not even just Christians. This could apply to any religion, but this is the one that I know. Another example would be that when the movie God's Not Dead came out, I was infuriated, of course, because it was the most ridiculous caricature of what some people thought atheists must be like. And I just ran down the list and just ticked off everything I could think of from the movie that I thought was a misrepresentation of atheists. And it was a wildly popular blog post because everybody else thought the exact same thing. And what I found is that Christians were sharing the article as well. One of the most popular Christian writers, who's a progressive Christian, is Rachel Held Evans. And she shared it on her Facebook page. And it was wildly successful there as well because they hated the movie just as much as I did. You hear what I'm saying? Many Christians hated that movie as much as I did because it was so stereotypical. It was so shallow and so cheesy. I mean, it wasn't just about how badly it depicted atheists. It was also about how much the movie sucked. You know, I mean, it was just a bad movie. It was bad acting, bad writing, bad music, everything. Unfortunately, most Christian movies are that way. But many Christians know that, and they hate it about their own culture. And I think it matters for us to notice when that happens. Because when we talk about Christians, sometimes we use too many generalities. And we talk like they all feel the same way about the Christian-identified things. And that's not true. There's a diversity within the Christian faith. We should learn to recognize that so that we're communicating more accurately. Freethinkers care about accuracy, don't they? It's a value that we share that's important to us. Trust me, try writing a blog post with a typo in it or with a slight incorrect attribution to a quote 10 minutes before you get 12 messages. That's just the way it works. I love that about the free thought community. They care about accuracy. We should care equally about accurately representing the Christian faith if we're talking about it. It doesn't serve anybody's interest to overstate things. But that may take taking time to talk to people and listen to them explain their own faith with all the nuances they want to put into it. I know you don't believe the same things they do, and maybe it's tiresome to you, but you might learn something more about what it is they believe. And I'm not ready to say that we have nothing to learn from Christians. I think that there's something about religion that as much as many of us who are not religious don't agree with, I think religion tells us something about human nature, about why is it that if I believe that we created religion, what does religion as a phenomenon tell me about human nature? What does this creation tell me about what it is that we feel the need for? You know, there's always something to learn from this. And I think it's Bill Nye that famously said that no matter who you meet, you need to realize that that person probably knows at least one thing that you don't know. That's pretty good. Okay, so here's my tips for how to improve communication between believers and non-believers. All right, number one, stay in touch with how they think by having conversations. Every once in a while, sit down and talk to somebody who thinks differently from you. And do it intently to try to learn what it is, a little bit better, what it is that they think. Now, I spend a lot of time on social media. Facebook seems to be the one that I favor the most. And there's a tendency with social media where you can select who it is you see and don't see. And this is an ongoing problem. In an increasingly polarized world, it's nauseating to have a lot of people in your social media feed who think things that are repugnant to you, right? It's very difficult, especially when it's election season. People start saying ridiculous, insane things. Really insane is the best way to say it. And there's an impulse to get rid of all those people out of your view so you don't have to deal with it. You just want to shut it off. And I have to do that, and sometimes you have to do that for sanity. But at the same time, I feel it's important to try to maintain some contact with people who think very differently from you. And sometimes I go out of my way to make sure I have an ability to connect with them and have some reason to have conversation with them. Sometimes that means getting on websites you don't agree with to see how are they covering this story. You know, if you have a favorite news website, do you ever click on one that you know always has an opposite view of what you think? You know, that's actually not a bad exercise once in a while, depending on your blood pressure. I wouldn't advise doing it too much if you struggle with that, but take your meds first, then get on that website and find out what it is that they think. It might be enlightening. It might even be that they say something you didn't think of before. But it means that you'll be educated and informed about the other person's views, and maybe you'll just be able to think through it a little bit better. But you won't be misrepresenting their views the next time you talk to them, because you will have taken the time to think through what it is they think. They probably didn't do that for your view. Maybe not, but so we'll do better than them. Why not? Right? Stay in touch with how other people think by taking some time to look at their sources of information and see what they're hearing. Maybe that even means going to church once in a while. I don't know. It could happen. Number two, learn what the other person values and let them explain why. This is especially relevant for mixed faith marriages. And I want to throw that in there because that's something I walked through myself. By mixed faith, I mean that I was at one point no longer a Christian and my wife was. And at that point, the tension was very difficult. And the more I've talked about that, the more I get contacted by friends who are going through that. Just last week, I got contacted by a friend in another state. I don't want to give too much information because he asked for anonymity. But he's dealing with the fact that he's now no longer a believer and his wife is. And he's asking me, what's your advice? What do I do? How do I relate to my own spouse? Since we're on opposite sides of this divide, I can't really talk about religion around her because I'll say things that upset her. And I don't know how to do this. My first advice to him was to go out and buy Dale McGowan's book, In Faith and in Doubt. Have you ever plugged that before? Okay, well, I'm plugging it right now. Dale McGowan wrote a book called In Faith and in Doubt. And it is a book directly, specifically written for couples in particular to work through their differences of belief if they are in a mixed faith marriage. And there's a lot of ways that can happen. One is they may come into the marriage already different. That's actually a pretty good situation because that means they know what they're getting into ahead of time. You know, she's a Presbyterian, he's a Baptist. They know what their differences are. Or she's an Episcopalian and he's an atheist. That actually might work, you know. I mean, you know, there's a lot of things that can work. But what happens if both come in and they're the same thing, but then one of them changes? There's a lot of permutations and combinations that can happen. And that's what happened to me. And that is extremely volatile. So he wrote an entire book on how to deal with that and gave multiple case studies and examples. It took him 4 years to write it. He did a lot of research behind it. It's a very well-written book. So I would advise if you're interested in hearing that, In Faith and in Doubt addresses that. So I advised him to get that book. Here's the thing about that. He was writing a book about couples and how to deal with differences in marriage. But those same principles can be applied to any relationships. And I would actually, I'm going to be stealing a number of his ideas and tips because it's the same basic principle. When you're talking to people who you have any reason to talk to because you care about them, you're in a relationship with them, it's your cousin, it's your friend, it's a coworker, it's your grandkids, whatever. Same things apply. Okay, so here's one of the things he would advise. Pick your battles. Pick your battles. You know that phrase, right? You don't need to make everything a big deal. Not everything is a big deal. Now, not everybody agrees on which things are the big deals, and that's part of the problem. And you have to talk through those things. But there's no reason to make a huge deal out of the things that aren't as important. And I'll step out a little bit and say an example for me. As a person who goes around and addresses groups and writes about things, I choose not to spend a lot of time fighting nativity scenes in government spaces. That's just my personal thing. Okay? Why? It's not that I don't care about that, because I do in a way, and I understand the principles behind it. It's just that where I am, there's bigger fish to fry. There's like more essential things to my own personal life and what affects where I live than whether or not a nativity is allowed on the governor's mansion's front lawn. You know? So it's the same thing in a relationship that's very volatile. You pick your battles. You learn which things are really important to you and find out what's important to them and see what you can negotiate about that. Don't make everything a big deal. State their view, learn to state their view as well as they could themselves. Daniel Dennett said something about this. I thought it was the best thing I've ever heard about how to have a meeting of the mind with somebody with whom you disagree. Dennett said this. He said, if you can get to the point where you can state the other person's opinion as well as they can, you state it so well that when you are finished, the other person says, I don't think I could have said that better myself. Once you have done that, they relax. And they begin to listen to what you have to say. Because, in a way, you've disarmed them a little bit. They were getting ready for a fight, but you just stated their view so accurately that now they no longer feel like they have to fight you. They feel like you understand. They know you disagree, but now you can have a more comfortable conversation. So I love that. That's one of the best pieces of advice I've ever heard. Learn the other person's viewpoint so well that you could state it as well as they could, and when you're finished, they'll notice it. And then they'll actually listen to what you have to say. Maybe you don't want to take that much time for the other person's viewpoint, and I understand that. But I'm thinking about my own personal life, where my children are all growing up to be evangelical Baptists. Just as a personal word, I told my girls, I have 4 daughters. They range from age 7 to 16. And they're all good Baptist girls. They're all really smart. I'm really proud of them. And about 6 months ago, I sat them down and just told them point blank, you know, I'm really not a Christian anymore. And they knew that was probably the case. It's been a good 5 years since I've been a Christian, but we just didn't talk about it directly. And they knew I wasn't going to church anymore, but I thought, you know what, we need to actually sit down and have this conversation. So I had it with them, and they each reacted in different ways that were characteristic to that child. Which is also true for my 3rd child. She began evangelizing me right away. She has a Sunday school teacher who considers himself an apologist, and so he's been training her to use apologetics methods on me as well. And honestly, I love it. I really do. I love it, because that's what I would have done when I was young, and she's not bad at it. You know, I like the display of intelligence that it shows, which is one of the differences between a free thinker and someone who feels the need to indoctrinate. And that's important. I'm going to come back to that in a second. I don't need my children to think the same way I do. I just want them to think. I'm going to be happy if they do that. That's what being a free thinker is. Okay, so my children are actually, you know, getting to the point where they're even evangelizing me. And I have to learn how to talk to them in a way that I both respect that difference. I don't make them feel like I'm looking down on them because we see these things differently. And I need to be able to listen to what they have to say, but I also want to counter some of the things that they say, because some of the things they say, I believe, are not right. I'll give an example of one in just a minute. Finding common ground with the other person is the goal. And by that, I think one of the best pieces of advice I've ever heard is to learn to distinguish between differences of belief and differences of values. That's one of the things that Dale points out in the book. There is a difference between having different beliefs versus having different values. Two people can believe two different things about the afterlife, or about prayer, or about many things, but they might have very, very similar values, priorities, as far as how you treat people, how you should work at your job. There's actually more values that I have in common with my Christian family, even though our beliefs are different. Those two things aren't always connected, and it's worth it to take the time to point that out. to talk through them and to realize, okay, so you and I believe different things about what happens to you after you die, but we both believe you should treat people fairly. We both believe that you should strive for integrity and honesty at your work and in your relationship. There's enough common values between people who believe different things, you can build a relationship off of that. Okay, so learning to distinguish between values and beliefs, that's a really helpful distinction. Drop the conversion mentality. Sorry, I'm with that. Drop the conversion mentality. This is a hobby horse for me. Many free thinkers because you want the rest of the world to be free thinkers too. There's this evangelistic urge to get others to be the same thing we are. And I feel that too, but at the same time, this is the difference between being a free thinker and being someone who indoctrinates. The goal is not to replace other people's supernaturalist beliefs with our non-supernaturalist beliefs. That's not the goal. The goal is to teach people how to be better critical thinkers, how to analyze what they themselves believe, because there's probably some things we believe that aren't logical. Even some of the things that we probably feel are scientifically nuanced and advanced, 50 years from now we're going to think are stupid. So just having a little bit of humility, epistemic humility, they call that, realizing that we can be wrong about things, can go a long way. And it also would help with those relationships. But dropping the conversion mentality would help a lot, and not trying to make everybody be what we are. I don't see that from everybody in the free thought movement. I really do. I see some very healthy encouraging of critical thinking skills. But one of my children came up to me a few weeks ago, the youngest, and she was in tears. And I asked her, I said, honey, what's wrong? And she said, I can't tell you. And she was weeping. My girls they're very emotional. And it took me a while to calm her down. And finally she said, well, I'm really afraid for you. And I asked her what she meant. Well, I had an idea of where this was going. She had just recently gotten saved herself. She's 7, and she had made a profession of faith. And then, commensurate with everything else that you do through this phase, she went and got baptized. I was there for that, trying to support her in any way that I can, because I didn't want to be the only person in her life that wasn't there for that. She got baptized, and then this series of events kicks in whereby they begin to tell you things like, now you're going to be in heaven with all the people that you love. And then they start listing how, all these other people. And then my name was missing from that list because I'm not a Christian. And it became clear to her that I'm not in the list of people she's going to see in heaven. And so she came to me in tears and said, I'm afraid I'm not going to see you in heaven after we die. Well, what would you say to your child at that point? And I had a host of feelings and thoughts to express at that point. Also, I knew that her older sister was largely responsible for getting her upset about that. So I had multiple conversations I had to have. The evangelist. So here's what people tell me I should do. They tell me I should take my 7-year-old who's being raised entirely within a Baptist mentality in Jackson, Mississippi, and tell her, as the only atheist in her life, tell her, you know what? Everything you have been told about life after death is wrong. Everything everyone believes in churches is wrong. Don't even know if Jesus really existed. They're saying just dump the entire, worldview of whatever standard atheist narrative is onto her. That is ridiculous. I'm sorry, but I know my family, I know my world, I know my culture. That's not how you do it. And that's not even how I think a free thinker should approach this. Somebody who believes in critical thinking skills would not say, okay, child, this whole belief system is wrong. Here's the correct belief system. No, you sit down and you begin to walk through the thought process with your child as best as you can. So what I did was I sat down with her and I began to talk to her within her own mindset. I began to ask questions about what she believes about God and about if she believes that God is a father, then how do fathers treat their children? And I began to ask, so how do I treat you as a father? Do I do mean things to you? If there's something I can do to keep you from being hurt, will I do it? Yes. And she's nodding. Will I, if I know that you are even trying to hurt yourself, will I try to stop it? Will I do everything I can to keep you from hurting yourself? She nodded and said, yes. That's what a good father does, right? Yes. Do you believe that God is a good father? Yes. Do you think I'm a better father than He is? No. She kind of laughed. And then I said, so why is it you're worried? Are you worried that God's going to be meaner to me than He will be to you? Are you worried that there could have been something he could have done to keep me from hurting myself, but he's not going to for some reason? Does he love you more than he loves me? All right, now, this may be a horrifying way to talk to a child, to some of you, because you're thinking, wait a minute, you're reinforcing a belief system that's wrong. I know. But you know what? We live in a complicated world, and people are complicated, and I understand cognitive development of children. I'm a teacher, and I'm a parent. And you don't just dump a whole new mentality on somebody. And I think what's true of my 7-year-old could also be true of grown adults as well. My 7-year-old only had 7 years to become indoctrinated into the system. How about somebody who's 50 or 60? Are you going to change their mind in one conversation? You know, so just extrapolate from that how we should talk to each other and think in terms of you're not going to change people's minds in one conversation. That's not even the way people learn things. You learn what it is that they think and begin to baby step it towards where you are. Ask questions that get them critically thinking about their own belief system and see if you can find some kind of common ground between where they are and where you are and then build on that. By the way, there's going to be time for question and answer when we're done, so you can ask me a little bit later after I get done with this. A little bit of respect goes a long way. Another distinction I try to make is the distinction between respecting people and respecting beliefs. You know, we say this a lot in public dialogue, and I think it's useful. Not all disagreement is disrespect. You can disagree with somebody's beliefs and ideas without disrespecting them as a person. Not everybody realizes that. Some people seem to take disagreement so personally, especially when it comes to religion, that, you know, their religion has become their identity. And when you disagree with their religion, they feel that you're attacking them personally. I get that. And, you know, realizing that can go a long way because it makes you more sensitive to the fact that when you're making your criticism of what it is that they think, you're going to be careful with how you put it. Don't overstate things. Don't be derogatory. Don't use slurs of any kind. And one thing I've been trying to get my atheist friends to quit doing is to assume that because somebody else believes things that don't make sense to them, that means they're stupid. It doesn't. It doesn't. I know some incredibly brilliant people who believe things that seem like nonsense to me. But number one, I remember when I used to believe those things too, which helps. That's one of the benefits, or, you know, you may say it's the downside, but I see it as a benefit of having formerly been religious. I remember what it was like to think that way at one point. And I felt like I was pretty smart, you know. So if I start calling them stupid, I'm calling myself stupid by association. So I'm a little bit less likely to do that. But it's not even accurate. Because the thing about intelligence is compartmental. You can be brilliant about a handful of things and almost imbecilic about others. You know? I feel like I understand people really, really well, but don't ask me to fix your car. You know? And it's not that I'm dumb, but if you get me around your car, I'm going to look dumb. You know? Intelligence is compartmental. I know a man who believes in creation science. It's like a hobby of his to study creation science. He thinks that the earth is less than 10,000 years old. He has scientific documents to back it up. And of course, those scientific documents are only printed within the insular world of creation science. But this man is brilliant. He is on a national consortium for oncology protocols. Like, he flies to Europe every year because he chairs the committee that sets research protocols for oncology. The man's brilliant. And he believes creation science is a real thing. So this is my point. People can be highly, highly intelligent and then believe things that I don't think make any sense at all. So don't assume that people are dumb just because they believe stuff like magic and you don't believe it. Learn to appreciate the diversity of belief that people have. I already said that before, but just to reinforce it, just because someone is a Baptist or is a Methodist or is a Presbyterian doesn't mean you know everything about what they believe. And not only that, but people who believe one set of things at 30 might not believe the same things at 35. And you need to allow for the possibility that people can grow and learn. And I've been corrected for that myself. I've had a problem with that sometimes too. I tend to sometimes assume that what a person believes one year will stay static the rest of their life. And they'll never change, and they'll never loosen up on that belief. That's not the way it works. I know I changed. You know, I should at least acknowledge that. It's just, I think it's a protective thing for me. I like to assume they're always going to believe that because I don't want to get my hopes up too much. That could be really frustrating. And I live around a culture that doesn't change much. It changes really slowly. There's a reason why I lean that way. But you should give the other person the benefit of the doubt that they might grow and learn and change what it is that they believe. Don't assume they're always going to believe the same things all the time. Two more things. Number one, if you see someone on the other side of this faith and doubt divide being mistreated or spoken to in a rude, disrespectful way by someone on your side, would you please take it upon yourself to say something to your friend about that and to take up for the other person? For a number of reasons. Number one, again, it doesn't serve anyone for us to be stating things inaccurately. It doesn't do any good to be disrespecting each other. It lowers the level of discourse. And all the people that you really want to have conversation with will leave the conversation because it's gotten so base and so low. You can help keep it at a higher level by just saying, that was really rude. I don't think you should say that. I do that all the time. I have a blog, and there's comments that people post. And when someone who is an atheist posts a comment that is disrespectful, I correct them, assuming I can get to the comments during the day. I've got a problem with filters at work. But I've got several moderators on my blog that I've asked, would you please correct people when they're disrespectful? And I don't care if it's the Christian or the atheist or anything in between. Whoever it is, make sure that they keep it respectful, because it's not helping to have people being mean to each other. So pull people back in and rein them in on your side as well, and learn to be sensitive to the fact that sometimes they're being rude. And then, of course, one last thing I got to at least throw in, and that is that building bridges between faith and doubt, you don't always need to do that, because there are some situations when there's an abusive relationship. There are some religious mentalities that are harmful, that I can't even find many redeeming things about because they're so controlling and so oppressive. In those situations, I would say maybe bridge building isn't what's needed. There are times when that's not the best thing. You wouldn't want to build a bridge to somebody who is shooting at you, right? So I would say that I at least have to acknowledge that there are circumstances in which opening up the lines of communication between a believer and a non-believer might not be the best thing, because the believer might be someone who just does not understand boundaries at all. As an adult child of older adult Christians, I have had to have those moments where I had to stop and put my foot down and draw boundaries with family members. Each of you have probably had to do that at some point or another. As you get older, your relationships change, both with parents, with cousins, with children, and then as the children get older, then your relationship with them changes, and those boundaries are constantly shifting. Sometimes you have to put your foot down and draw a boundary and say, you know what, here's where your responsibility ends and mine begins. And you need to learn to respect that. And so you don't always need to just open up even more lines of communication. There are times when sometimes you have to shut off communication because you've tried and you've tried and you've tried, and they just won't respect your personal autonomy, your dignity as a person. And when you detect that that person is someone who can't do that, who can't afford you the dignity of treating you like an autonomous human being, sometimes you just got to cut it off and say, well, I tried. I did my best. But we're just going to have to go our separate ways, and maybe we'll try this again some other time, but we're going to have some distance between us for a while. So that's my balance to the concept of bridge building. I want to hear any questions that you guys have got, because I may have said something you thought needed to be nuanced, or, oh, you got a mic?